Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the panel discussion Posthuman, presented in the context of Nicola Feldman Kiss's exhibition Witness. My name is Stephanie Nadeau. I'm the curator of public engagement at the Ottawa Art Gallery. Bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Merci de nous joindre ce soir pour la table ronde posthumain, en lien avec l'exposition Témoin de Nicola Feldman Kiss. Je me présente Stéphanie Nadeau, commissaire à la médiation culturelle à la Galerie d'art d'Ottawa. Veuillez noter que la discussion serait en anglais, mais si vous voulez poser vos questions en français, durant la période de questions, on peut faciliter la traduction si nécessaire. As always, the OAG acknowledges the Canada Council for the Arts, the Ontario Council for the Arts, and the City of Ottawa for their generous support of our programming. You can find more information on upcoming OAG events in our exhibition booklet, which are just over there on the table. If you haven't grabbed one already, please do. You can also sign up for our mailing list. We have a sheet over there with a pen on a clipboard if you want to hear more about upcoming events and programs. Please note that tonight's event is being recorded for broadcast purposes. We'll be putting it up on YouTube just as an audio link. Alors, la discussion ce soir sera enregistrée. Soyez conscients de ce fait. This evening's panelists have been invited to help us wade through the salient questions of law, ethics, morality, and biology raised in the exhibition Witness. You will hear both direct responses to the artwork in the exhibition, as well as perspectives on broader themes that the exhibition engages with, such as the history and legality of displaying human remains, the commercial value of posthumous tissue, and the ways in which memory and empathy can be engendered through presence. Chairing the panel is Dot Tour, who is a writer, cultural historian, and professor of visual and cultural studies at OAG University. She has published extensively on Canadian and Latin American art from a post-colonial perspective, with a focus on performance, new media, and photography. She also engages in scholarly research on early colonial Latin America and Indigenous European relations. Tour holds a PhD in history from the University of Toronto and has received numerous awards for her work, most recently OCADU's Distinguished Research Scholarship and Creative Activity Award. Her current writing and collaborative projects address the relationship of social memory and witnessing to political agency and decolonization. Dot will also be contributing to the exhibition catalog. Please join me in welcoming Dot Tour.
I want to welcome everyone here tonight. What a fantastic turnout. It's really, thank you for joining us. I'm going to do something, normally as a moderator, I would just turn it immediately over to the panelists, but I'm going to start with a short preamble. And one of the reasons I decided to do this preamble is because I read the article that was published in Ottawa Life, Ottawa's magazine, and then I thought, well, actually, I'd like to share something that maybe will speak to what I think many of the panels will speak in their own way, but also just to what I think are some of the issues here. So what I'm going to do is read the short preamble, then I'm going to introduce the panelists, and have each panelist introduced at the time they speak. Sometimes I find when you do them all at once, you're like going, who was that again? So that's how I'll do it. And the preamble is actually something that I wrote, very stream of consciousness. I'm not sharing the whole thing with you. After the very first time that I went to Nicola Feldman Kiss's studio in preparation for thinking about whether to think about writing for the catalog. So, yesterday I went to Nicola's studio. She is a beautiful mixed-raced woman. Her mother is Prussian Lutheran, grandfather is Polish Jewish on her father's side. They married in 1931 in Germany and then left for England, and in 1941 went to Jamaica, Barbados. Her grandmother had a zoo in Barbados where she raised show dogs. Where is the Jamaican family? Why does Nicola not talk about this, except to speak about plantation owners and slaves and shadism as blending and rape as upper mobility to gain entrance to the master's house? Her father comes to the University of Toronto on a science scholarship and then moves to Ottawa, where he works for the NRC. She describes her childhood as bucolic and colorblind, that she never experienced a sense of being racially mixed until she went to study and work in the US. There is something of the dispossession of the black body here that has been passed down on an unconscious level, wired, imprinted. Nicola describes how she has been in psychoanalysis, had been at one point, in psychoanalysis for 7 years, but that when her analysts began to incorporate her into her own family life, the analyst's life, she was no longer an analysand. Instead, herself is constituted through the body, through Reiki, through alternative healing techniques, through extreme training, through her art. She creates a mean body. She creates a reliquary of objects that are about relational encounters, about memories of her mother, of her father, of a Nazi menace, of a desire for the fascist body. She creates an eye that follows her, an object relations device. She creates a glass replica of the limbic mode that sheds tears. She creates self-portraits of herself nude and curled up on the crushed and compacted remnants of the bed her father had built for her, an uncanny gesture that exudes a repressed memory of childhood. She tells a story of how as a child she would spy on everyone, winking to take a picture, and then her father bought her a camera. She makes a series of works called Childish Objects. Then a few years ago, after crushing her childhood bed and lying twisted on top of it, she decides that she will embrace and explore the trauma of others and applies to the Canadian Armed Forces to go to, quote, in her words, the worst place on earth, which she has decided is the Sudan. Now graves and bones into her lexicon. She buys a skeleton on the internet. It costs $4,000. She tells us how, because I was there with actually Michelle from the gallery, she tells us how when she didn't when she realized the skeleton was incomplete, that the skull was marked instead of pristine, that she went on to months of negotiating to get from the bone company the right kind of bones. Is this a reenactment of an analysis that ended up in a familial scenario? Is this a doppelganger? The bones sit in the middle of her studio floor in a box on a metal frame stand nestled in white gauze. She has worked on them to bleach them, to make them whiter, not brown like when they came out of the ground. She makes photographs of beautiful, young, black bodies cradling the bones, a strange metaphor for miscegenation. There is something so deep here that I cannot fully comprehend about the trauma of mixed races, of memories of the colonizer and the colonized, lodged in one body that cannot reconcile the violence of its own history. Indigenous cultures have a legacy of incorporating others into their kinship structures, including Europeans in the Americas. So the Canadian state decided to destroy their kinship structures and their culture. Slavery was a tearing away of kinship at its source in Africa. The only hope of survival was to endure the white man's brutal regime. Instead of a culture embedded in the land and in the bones, the colonial legacy of slavery is about transplantation, of loss, of homelands, of bodies, of bones. So, what does it mean that we're here today? What does it mean when I read about the outrage that is being enacted, expressed, represented, directed at the artist, and not at the histories long in the making in which we are all victims and oppressors, complicit viewers of the bones on display? We will all end up as bones in the earth. What matters is the stories we tell about the bones and the stories we tell about the dispossessed. For tonight, we have the great privilege of a panel in which 4 presenters, each in their own way, will tell their stories. And I hope that this sharing of stories will encourage all of us in the audience and together up here to reflect on the nexus of issues raised by Nicola Feldman Kiss's exhibition and to participate in the dialogue that we will have that will follow the presenters. So I would like now to introduce the first presenter. Professor Joan St. Louis teaches law at the University of Ottawa, where her work involves social justice and legal culture. Joanne is passionate about her art. Her preference is to work with oils strictly using palette knives. She co-curated and was an artist participant for Corrective Lens, challenging representation of women in art. That was in 2008. She is the first Black woman elected as the Bencher of the Law Society of Upper Canada. Bravo. The governing body for over 47,000 Ontario lawyers and 7,000 paralegals in Ontario. Paralegals, yeah. She is the recipient of the 2008 Dreamkeepers Life Achievement Award from the Martin Luther King Jr. Day Coalition. Thank you for joining us tonight.
I'm actually grateful that I'm speaking for only 10 minutes, because that is probably the totality of what I can say. As you can tell, I'm a lawyer, and I do art to keep myself sane. What I'm sharing with you is probably very much you could equally be here and responding yourself to the works that you've seen. But I do want to tell you a little bit of my perspective and my engagement with the works as I saw them. One of the reasons I'm drawn to art, and it's not actually the nature of the art that I paint all the time, but why I enjoy going to art exhibits and experiencing the work of other artists, is because I'm drawn to the disruption of what I take for granted in everyday life. I'm drawn to somebody else's vision and attempt to destabilize my presumption of what is real, what is history, what is understood. And to me, that's a central piece around all of the work that Nicola's produced upstairs. It is about that engagement with who we are and how we relate to other people. And so I was fascinated when she was doing her presentation. She spoke very much about a personal narrative, whereas I was seeing the work as representational of an experience, that disjuncture that's there. There are a couple of things I want to say. My first reaction to the bones, it was actually tied to something I often say to my students. I actually don't have a feeling of controversy around the fact that they're human remains. I have this view that Black bodies stack up to a great amount, whether we're talking about Rwanda or anything else. And we need thousands of Black bodies before we can be seen by the West. We need thousands of Black bodies, and it doesn't matter if they're children, before anybody will pay attention and change a policy. And even then, we're much more interested in what I would consider a rather esoteric conversation, which is trying to get us to look at that very issue, than figuring out how we feed those children, how we keep them alive, how we keep them safe. So that's where I started. And one of the things, to me, bones are a frame. We all become bones. But justice isn't made by bones, it's made by flesh. Justice is made by when those bones are covered with our flesh and our skin, and that combination creates an experience space. And I think that's what she's saying. I was particularly drawn to the way in which photography is, and our idea of photography as capturing that which is real. You know, that sort of thinking about Sudan, the photojournalist who snaps the picture of the horror, where Nicola's turned that into a performance in and of itself to say something in addition about herself, about the tools, about the relationship of the artist to the tools. And I thought that was very powerful. I saw her work as very much about geopolitics and tremendously about race and issues of racism. It was fascinating to me to watch the video. I was actually a bit stressed out as I was watching the video because I couldn't reconcile the tune, and all of you have watched The Sound of Music, right? And so I'm hearing, you know that wonderful, Christopher Plummer, there's the family, and there's a little clock and the cuckoo clock, and the little kids popping up and down, and we just love it, and Julie Andrews, and aren't they the perfect, wonderful couple, and they're fleeing Nazism. And I'm sitting there hearing this thing, almost like a drill by the time I'd watched it long enough, happening to me. As I'm watching, and the thing for me as I was watching Peacekeeper is not the bullet sounds, which was bad enough, not the breathing kind of sound, but I kept actually asking myself, where are the bodies? Where are the bodies? Where are the bodies? Where are the bodies? So this metaphor of the sweeping, but almost that feeling that I still wasn't in the most visceral part of the experience. And even by shielding me from that, I was still feeling so disorganized inside. I was feeling so fundamentally disrupted. So, I think I'm probably coming up to my 10 minutes. The final piece I would observe, and certainly I'm open to any comments or questions or things that that I may not have mentioned. But the other piece that struck me was part of a phrase that attached to one of the pieces in Childless Objects when you talked about that issue of nurturing. I would nurture your pain and feed you. That act of nurture and pain is so disjunctive, And I thought, if I take that image of the hand and that image of the wig of your youth, and you're nurturing that pain, then what am I feeding? Am I feeding, is it psychic? Is it blood? It got me right back into the reliquary where I saw the syringes, where I'm seeing these different objects. I'm thinking of leakages of the body. I'm thinking of piercings of the body. And so I saw this real kind of interrelationship and enmeshment happening there around pain that to me was through every single piece. That's what Sudan is. That's what it is. It is pain. It is unfathomable pain. And yet we have these words talking, but the words cannot capture their pain. The 250 people gone, the 1,500 displaced. And so I felt, it's probably obvious, I found the pieces deeply moving and really engaging. And the final thing I would observe is that when you said after Africa, my thing was, as I looked at the title, because I think Africa is always an afterthought for anybody. And so I commended the fact that you moved Africa from the periphery to the center of the work and said, yes, after Africa for you in terms of your journey, but for the people viewing, it's to bring Africa immediately present and disruptively so.
Our second panelist tonight is Dr. Ian McKinnell, who is a lecturer at Carleton University, where he has been teaching students across all levels in a variety of subjects, most particularly anatomy and physiology, since 2010. Born and educated in the United Kingdom, Dr. McKinnell attended both the University of Kent and the University of Oxford, where he obtained a PhD in developmental biology. He subsequently undertook postdoctoral research work in London, in the United Kingdom, and Ottawa, specializing in the fields of embryology and stem cell biology. So welcome.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, so first I just want to say thank you everyone for coming out. This is a rare sort of treat for me. I normally, when faced with an audience, it's sort of 550 angry undergrads. So this is really quite pleasant, so thank you. Thank you, Stephanie, and also thank you, Nicola, for a fabulous exhibit as well. So what Stephanie asked me to do actually was to talk about sort of, I guess what you might say, some of the, from the scientific perspective, the economies of the body, right? And sort of how we have interacted with the body over the, sort of historically speaking, in terms of teaching and particularly teaching medical students and that sort of thing. And so I'm sort of an embryologist, which means, I'm absolutely obsessed and fascinated by the way a single cell zygote goes on to develop into all the amazing structures of the body, right? And so part of that, in terms of understanding embryology, is understanding anatomy, and that's something I've been teaching for a while. And anatomy, the word means either to cut up or to cut open. And so anatomy has always been essentially a study of dissection. It has been taking the body, cutting the body open, and seeing what's inside. And in terms of modern history, in terms of modern understanding, maybe the better way to put it is you actually have to go back, right way back to the ancient Greeks, right? So Galen was the first real anatomist, the first person to cut open bodies and really explore them. The thing is, Galen's perspective, he was the physician to the gladiators, and so that was where he got his bodies from. The only other option for bodies for those who were interested was essentially prisoners, right? So executed criminals whose bodies were considered worthless could be taken by interested physicians and interested anatomists, and that lasted for centuries and centuries. And so the whole concept of, for example, the grave robbers and that sort of thing, this is where physicians who were interested in anatomy had to get their specimens, so to speak. So what happened when we hit the Renaissance was this sort of renewed interest in antiquity, right? The beauty of antiquity was actually really a sort of a turning point in the study of the body and the study for anatomists. And so actually what ended up happening was there sort of various influential families of the time that would bring together interested physicians and anatomists, and they would bring together the artists as well. So this is, these beautiful drawings of Da Vinci, right, where he's just incredible anatomical descriptions. Well, this was sort of all by bringing him together with physicians, and it turns out it was almost like a very well-to-do thing on a Friday evening for well-to-do families. Was the Medicis, for example, would bring physicians, and they would bring anatomists, and they would all, and the artists, and they would all watch a dissection, right? And then the artists would draw afterwards. That being said, as sort of odd as that sounds, that was sort of the turning point. Like there became then this renewed interest and so on, but still the source for the bodies for this sort of work still remains somewhat dubious for many, many years. But if you fast forward to now, what you see is sort of it doesn't take any effort to go online, and what you'll find are amazing resources for anatomy. So anyone can go on and you can look at things called the biodigital human. There's something called the Google body, right? And these are all absolutely wonderful resources from which you can learn anatomy. The thing is, from my perspective, and what I'd always try and stress, is that there's simply no substitute if you're trying to educate and teach for the real thing, and this gives us some issues, I guess, to deal with. So, by way of an example, 2 years ago it was discovered that there's a ligament we never knew existed in our knee. Now, it's not like the knee was considered a mystery to us, right? I mean, the knee has been explored and operated on countless numbers of times, and yet it was actually only through modern dissection work that we actually discovered there is something new that sits there and actually stabilizes your knee and prevents it moving laterally. So all this really is to say that as someone who teaches anatomy, what we wanted to do was to give our students the best sort of education we could at Carleton. And so what Stephanie really sort of wanted me to talk about was this project we put in mind, which we called the Carleton Anatomy Project. And what we wanted to do was, as best we could, obtain the closest thing to cadavers. We're not a medical school, so we don't have a willed body program or anything like that. And so what we turned to was plastination. And so you're probably all aware of this from the Body Worlds exhibits, right? So there was one recently in Museum of Nature, for example. It was called Inside Animals. And so that's a Body Worlds exhibit as well. So plastination was actually, everyone assumes it's new. It's been running since the 70s, right? So there's a guy called Gunther von Hagens who actually developed the technique in the 70s. And for a while, all medical schools used to have a plastination facility, a small facility that they could, after the cadavers at the end of term, so to speak, they would then be, some of the parts would be plastinated in order to continue the teaching. And unfortunately, it sort of fell out of favor, and now many schools still have them, but they have no one who actually knows how to use them. And then you have this sort of rise in the body worlds, and suddenly you became sort of famous again. So what we wanted to do was try and bring this into our teaching. So we started this Carleton Anatomy project. We approached our students, and we asked them if they were interested. They were absolutely overwhelmingly interested. And so we started essentially a crowdfunding campaign. It's called the Carleton Anatomy Project. We ran it through something called Future Funder at Carleton. And we were, with a lot of hard work from a lot of students, able to actually raise enough funds so that we could obtain some plastinated specimens. So we approached a company called Corcoran, who for 20 years have been supplying these types of materials to medical universities. And, sorry,
No,
I'm not going to say too much.
I'm fascinated about Corcoran.
Okay. So in fact, one of the reasons why we went to Corcoran is that Corcoran uses a particularly interesting language when you sort of inquire about getting these pieces. So what Corcoran says is that they do not sell human body parts. What they do is they donate them to acceptable universities, or however they want to sort of characterize it, for a cost of essentially recovery, right? So the cost of the plastination process and the dissection. And they are very sort of adamant about this. They use this very interesting language that it is a donation to the university for cost recovery. And they're also very sort of adamant that they number, let's say, all of the individuals who will their body to this program. And one of the things they say is that these bodies are individuals who have willed their body, and the specific language they use is for the sole purpose of medical teaching. Okay, so this, and this raises a whole series of interesting issues that I presume a lot of people have questions about anyway. But we went ahead and were fortunate enough to be able to actually obtain some of these from Corcoran, and so our students will start using them in January. Now, I think I'm probably pretty much off my time now. But there's also, just to finish off one final minute, there are a whole series of what we call body economies in biology, whether it's, for example, the buying and selling of cord blood. So if you have your cord blood put into a public cord bank, the public cord bank has the option to actually sell that blood on, right? You can sell it on to interested parties who are willing to buy it. You can buy embryonic stem cells that have come from human embryos. If you are a research facility in the UK, there's something called the UK Stem Cell Bank that does that. But you can also buy what we call cell lines, human tumorigenic cells that you can grow, and there's a super famous example of this, the Henrietta Lacks story, that I would recommend all of you to look at. So I'll leave it there so I don't go over my time, and just to say that, I love the exhibit. It was absolutely fabulous, and for me as a biologist, when I see it, I just see beauty of the body, to be honest. And I thought that really came through for me. Thank you, Nicola.
Thank you. Our third presenter tonight is Mara Berna, who is counsel with the Ministry of the Attorney General. She holds a BFA from Concordia University, as well as both common and civil law degrees from McGill University. Mara was called to the Ontario Bar in 2013. She's participated in several conferences and has published in the areas of Aboriginal law, cultural heritage, intellectual property, and the relationship between rule of law and economic development. Mara has also gained international recognition as a contemporary artist practicing in the area of performance and site-specific multimedia works. A notable work, www.venus.com, was produced on site in South Africa and France amidst Sartre's Bartman's repatriation to South Africa for burial.
Oh, that's
So if somebody could just nudge me if I go over time. I'm gonna try and get this. How do I do this?
Go to view,
Yeah.
and then scroll down and go to slideshow.
Sorry.
That's it.
Lovely. So I just need to say this verbally, that the opinions are mine alone and not, they don't represent those of Ontario. So I just, I wanted to talk about a couple of things with respect to the display of deceased human bodies. I'm going to start with a bit of a talk on plastination. So thank you again for a great introduction. So plastination, as Ian said, was invented in the 70s, and there was a patent on it, which recently expired, I believe. But it's the process of taking a dissected human body and freezing it, taking all the fat and water out of it, replacing that with acetone, vacuuming out the acetone and replacing it with plastic, basically resins. So the end result of a plastinated body is that it's about 75% plastic and 25% organic. So these two images here, so excuse me if anybody is sort of sensitive, but these two images are from an exhibit in Paris that was actually subsequently banned a few weeks after it opened. But there were, within the world of plastination exhibits, there seems to be two camps. There's the body worlds, which is about quote-unquote willed donation, and willed donation, and then on the other side of it are a bunch of competitors, and they often use bodies from China. And there was a lot of controversy that erupted sort of in the mid-2000s, whereby there were allegations that the bodies that were obtained for plastination were in fact executed Chinese prisoners. In 2008, the Attorney General's office launched an investigation, in 2007, against Premier Exhibitions, which is a competitor of Body Worlds. And there was a show in New York that was happening at the time, and so the Attorney General was looking into it, saying, well, are these allegations in fact true? And Premier Exhibitions had been saying all along that, they were obtained legitimately, and in fact, after about a year-long investigation, a settlement was achieved, and part of that settlement was the following disclaimer. This exhibit displays human remains of Chinese citizens or residents, blah, blah, blah. Premier relies solely on the representation of its Chinese partners and cannot independently verify that they do not belong to persons executed while incarcerated in Chinese prisons. So in fact, the end result achieved was that they could not disprove that they were, in fact, prisoners. In 2006, China enacted a law that prohibited the sale of bodies, but in fact, it seems that China has become a bit of a hub for plastination. And in fact, corporate company that you mentioned, they get a lot of their bodies from China. And in fact, the import, my understanding, I haven't researched it deeply, but my impression is that these objects are sort of moving through the world as plastic objects. That's how they're getting imported. And certainly the bodies on display are imported and moving through the world as art objects. So just to give you an indication of wealth, in and around the time the settlement was happening, Premier Exhibitions had a net income of $7.4 million. Part of the settlement was a 2-year monitor that was installed to oversee the terms of the settlement, but New York had mandated that new exhibitions going forward, that Premier would have to, in fact, have proper documentation that would include consent of the dead bodies or next of kin, or of the deceased person before he died and then next of kin. And $50,000 in escrow for people who wanted to refund their ticket. So that was in 2008. 2009, fast forward to France, and there was a similar, this is now Encore Events, which is another competitor. And the courts banned the exhibition by virtue of Article 1611, which is, it's codified, but it's funerary law, and it mandates respect for the dead. It's down here. The respect owed to the human body does not stop upon death. The remains of dead people, including ashes of the body following cremation, must be treated with respect, dignity, and decency. And the sort of main premise of this is that an exhibition for commercial gain, by its very nature, runs contrary to the notion of giving respect to the dead. What's interesting is that in and around 2009, there was an exhibition that was launched at the Musée de l'Homme in Paris as well. It was their last exhibition before they closed for renovations. And so it was a sort of open your closets, let's get our collection out there. It's the last exhibit before we close for, I think they're still closed or they're opening now, so it was about a 6-year lag. So what was quite interesting to me was I found out that in fact Sarah Bartman, whose remains were repatriated to France in 2002, they, at that time when there was a legislation that mandated her repatriation, and by virtue, I'll just flip around back to the 16.1, which is based on bioethics law, and it says everyone has the right to respect for his body. Every body is inviolable. The human body, its elements, and its products cannot be the subject of property rights. And so this they call it imperative legislation because it was a piece of law that was specifically about Sarah Bartman, or Sargi Bartman, saying that her remains are going to be repatriated to France.
South Africa.
Pardon me?
South Africa.
Sorry, South Africa. And so this happened in 2002, and during the debates when they were enacting the law, they in fact, there was someone who had said, I forget his name, Gerard Schwartz something, please excuse me, but he said, Sargi's remains cannot be the subject of property rights owned by the museum, and that on those grounds and other grounds, bioethical grounds, issues of repatriation, her indigenous community of origin, they repatriated the remains. At the time, though, they kept the cast, so they made a cast. She was living in France when she died, and the police obtained her body, and Geoffrey Saint-Hilaire, who's quite a famous, what is he? Do you know who he is, Geoffrey Saint-Hilaire? He's, there was Georges Cuvier, was Surgeon General but an anatomist. Anyway, they took her body, did a plaster cast of her body, or made a mold of her body, and then dissected it, and then made a skeleton, extracted her genitals and her brain, bottled the genitals, made the skeleton, put those things on display in the Museum of Mankind for 150 years, along with the cast. So, when they repatriated the remains, I was in France, and the question was, well, what about this cast? And so nothing really was said. Certainly France didn't bring back the cast. Well, it wasn't really part of the dialogue, shall we say. So I find out in 2009 they exhibit the cast. Only they exhibit the cast fully covered behind a glass vitrine, and then covered in a cloth. The actual body is covered in a cloth, and they have this history of Sargi Bartman, because during her lifetime, of course, she was exhibited to paying crowds, and I mean, some of you are nodding, so you know her history. So we have this situation where the French courts ban the plastination exhibit out of respect for the dead, and that same time, we've got the Museum of Mankind, who's exhibiting this very contentious cast, but fully clothed. And so here's another view where we've got this sort of vitrine, and then we've got the cloth, and we just see her face, and then we have this sort of announcement, or this text within the exhibition that says exhibition of deformed humans. So one questions the sort of schism that happens across spaces. On the one hand, it's an indecency to humans and dead bodies to exhibit them for commercial gain. On the other hand, it's possible for museum professionals to make these kinds of decisions amidst controversy and what do we say? I don't even know what to call that. What's the word where you forget? Amnesia. It's amnesia. So here's a situation where we've got a mummy that's fully covered. And this is the Manchester University Museum. Tiffany Jenkins has become quite well known for her writings on the sort of crisis of cultural authority, which is how she explains it, whereby you have museum professionals who are sort of taking up the reins of dead bodies and sort of taking responsibility for the fact that they now have to be covered. And it's a means, it's an instrumental means for which the museum can regain legitimacy. While that's perfectly persuasive, on the other hand, she bases a lot of her arguments on questionable sort of premises. So one of them is on unclaimed bodies, which she sort of relegates like mummies. They're the long dead, so they're not, it's not a living indigenous community of origin that could possibly be offended. They're long dead, so are current day Egyptians offended? We don't know, but is the general public offended? And her basis is that, well, if the public wants to see them, why cover them? And so, oh wow, okay, it just goes so fast.
Can I just give you my session?
Pardon me?
I said, can I give you my session?
Okay, so this is a beautiful quote by a bioethicist who says, at a deeper level, I wish we had never regarded a human being lonely, since a spirit of fraternity should make us claim the unclaimed. Some very interesting writing on the concept. So we've got this sort of real kind of, I don't know, people are very taken by the story or by the fact that Chinese plastinated bodies may be executed prisoners. And then we have this like sort of the moral ground that Gunther von Hagen can stand on by saying, well, these are willing donors. But what's interesting is when you really peel away the surface, are they really willing donors? Do they really understand the significance of donating their bodies for the pursuit of plastination? And what Berlin argues is that it would be interesting to know if people would continue to donate their bodies to plastination specifically if they really understood the history of anatomy and the history of medical schools. And I think, as Ian touched upon, certainly there were public dissections were quite commonplace, and they were executed prisoners. What else? I've got to wrap up, but he sort of, what he says, which I think is quite interesting, is he says, the formal duties that we might owe to the dead, and formal duty meaning, informed consent or will, how you want to die and how you want to be buried, for example, presupposes that we have core substantial duties that are owed to the dead, and that those are things like respect, the meaning behind actions. So what he's saying is that, if people are not really informed when they give that consent, do we as a society have an obligation to control how decisions are made about dead bodies? And so it's quite interesting, I think, when you uncover the sort of moral ethics around plastination, certainly on the exhibit side. These beings are traveling around the world, and they last for 4,000 years. Some of them are potentially Chinese executed prisoners. Others are, permanently in, very ridiculous positions. For example, throwing a basketball, riding a horse, playing tennis, playing archery. And so I think there's a lot of very substantial moral considerations that deserve a little bit more in-depth time and time sort of not becoming very eloquent right now, but there's two sources that if anybody's interested in really learning more about sort of the implications of the history of anatomy and plastination, this plastination phenomena that's upon us. These are two really wonderful sources to take a look at, so I invite you to read them. Thank you.
I believe that our last presenter probably needs no introduction, but I will introduce her. Nicola Feldman-Kiss is a Toronto-based artist who was born and raised in Ottawa, Ontario. She explores relational interpretations of body and embodiment, identity and autobiography, witness and traumatic memory. She is a multilingual artist of Canadian, German, and Jamaican ancestry, whose work examines themes and acts as a social political commentary addressing, among other topics, the impact and traces of her own German Jamaican heritage on the development of the plural identity. Nicola earned a BFA in photography at the University of Ottawa in 1991 and an MFA photography, art and critical studies at Cal Arts in 1996. Her work has been featured in solo exhibitions, including Nicola Feldman-Kiss Mean Body, that toured to venues in Ontario, Quebec, Italy, the UK, Finland, Sweden, Mexico, Switzerland, and the US. Recent works relating to conflict, culture, and mass migration have been the subject of the cross-country touring exhibition Terms of Engagement, and that's the work that features what she produced in Sudan. The artist has participated in high institution residencies with the United Nations Mission in Sudan in the Armed Forces Artist Program, the Ottawa Art Institute, and the National Research Council of Canada.
I feel a little bit talked out about my work, so I'm going to try and talk about some of the subjects that were raised here on the panel, if that's fine. And upstairs, when I did the walkthrough, at the beginning, I promised that I would give an opportunity to people ask questions, and then I proceeded to talk through all of the opportunity to ask questions. So I hope that I will talk a little bit now, and I might use some of my however many minutes I'm allotted to begin to open the floor for feedback from all of your. I'm sure there's a lot of thoughts and questions floating around amongst you right now, so I'm very curious to hear about a little bit of that response. I have a long fascination with the body, and my long fascination with the body has brought me into all kinds of extra-disciplinary engagement. So right out of undergraduate school in 1990, I found myself in the Canada Conservation Institute crafting a ball gown out of a cow's reproductive organ. The fallopian tubes, the ovaries, and the fimbria formed the leg of mutton sleeves. The uterus, the bodice, the cervix, the waist, and the vaginal canal became the skirt and the train. The Canada Conservation Institute facilitated that I work with an anatomy technician from Queen's University and their freeze dryer to fashion this garment, which ultimately was about this big. That piece got eaten by some cats at the first studio that I had at the EBA. Strangely, the cats survived the resin just fine. Following that piece, I had a daughter in 1993. I didn't know that I was going to have a daughter, but I did know that following the birth of my son, I wanted to leave the hospital with my placenta. So I proceeded to interview a number of OBGYNs to see who could facilitate this ambition. During that pregnancy, I learned about the Human Tissue Act. I learned about the trade in stem cells and for-profit motive behind our public health care system in the sale of tissue into research from our hospitals. I was an early conspiracy theorist, and I became very opposed to the idea of the stem cells in my child's umbilical cord and those high impact bits of biology that were contained in our placenta to go into an institution not of my choosing, or a business or a research enterprise not of my choosing, to promote research. Ultimately, I found a doctor who I'll let remain nameless, who told me it was not legal and within his professional ethical boundaries to promise to give me something which fell within the guidelines of the Human Tissue Act. Yet he agreed with my challenge to the authority and agreed that he would perform subterfuge and allow me to leave the hospital with my placenta. So after the birth of my daughter, he came back to visit me with a Loblaws bag. Inside the Loblaws bag was a clear plastic bag, and inside that clear plastic bag was a Ziploc bag, and in that Ziploc bag was my placenta and the umbilical cord and what remained of the amniotic sac. During my pregnancy, I researched all about what to do with this placenta, and I learned all about what different cultures do, what women in different cultures do with their placenta tissue: bury it, eat it, preserve it. And I found an anatomy technician at University of Toronto who would agree to plastinate it for me. So came home from the hospital with my new baby, and I put my placenta in the freezer. 3 months later, I shipped it off via Purolator to the anatomy technician at University of Toronto. 10 months later, by this time I was living in Los Angeles pursuing graduate studies, and a package arrived in the mail. It was my plastinated placenta. It was 1994. That piece is entitled Flat Cake, and it's not included in this exhibition. Since then, I have pursued a very critical study of the medical institution. Most recently, I am very interested in how the birth of the medical research program has developed hand in hand with conflict-related narratives. My father's situation in Germany in the early 1930s and their departure from Germany in 1930, whatever it was, early 1930s, was precipitated by what they call Raschenstadt, and I don't speak German, so I apologize for my lack of German pronunciation, was anti-miscegenation laws. Those people who were interfaith married, and from the first set of Nuremberg laws that were introduced by the Nazi Party, forced my father's family to flee. My grandmother was Lutheran and my grandfather was Jewish, and their marriage and their love union became illegal because of being interfaith. Those families who were interfaith and non-quote-unquote Aryan, who fell within the boundaries of those laws, the children were then said to be, the parents were imprisoned and the children became wards of the court. And those children, I have come to understand, are the children who populated the medical research program, the very early medical research program. So in fact, within my personal ancestral family narrative, conflict and medical research are intimately tied. So I float within my research between the history of medicine and contemporary medicine anatomy and conflict, violence, human-on-human violence. When I encountered this opportunity to buy the skeletal remains, which it's funny because I call them both skeletal remains and I call them osteological specimen. And One calls from the artistic side of me and the spiritual side of me in the term remains. When I call it osteological specimen, I'm calling from the scientific and objective side of my research, the more objective, descriptive, and detached from my kind of spiritual humanity. So they are both things for me. And encountering the opportunity to buy the remains was similar to me encountering an illegality about owning a piece of my body and retaining possession of a piece of my body by taking it out of the hospital. These moments that over my kind of artistic history that trouble my conscience, those have become the salient, productive, and creative moments for me. The bones that are contained in my piece upstairs and between here and there, they come out of a long history of research about the body and a lot of thought and contemplation about what bodies are to us. After acquiring the package from the Vancouver company that sold me the bones, I held on to it for 6 months as a closed package. And, you know, unlike that sort of childish moment we get into when a new package arrives in the mail, I didn't jump to open the bones. I had some fantasies and ideas that there would be this aura of spirit that came out of the box. I had an idea that in that box was contained an individual. I had inside my heart a trouble about the fact that I was able to buy a foreign individual, but unable to acquire a kin. Similarly, when I fell in love with my partner, my current husband, we made a commitment to each other to will each other our remains, so that I could give him my body and he could give me his body. And we imagined that as bones and not flesh. He's a lawyer, and we did a lot of research to discover a legal basis for us to own each other's bodies, and there was none. So, in fact, there is no legal framework in Canada for me to engage to will my lover my bones. And there's no legal framework in Canada for me to receive my lover's bones. Yet, I'm able to purchase the bones of another, a foreign other. This made me start asking self-questions about who is body, who is individual, who has rights under international law, what is international law? Is international law legitimate? So if I can't buy a Canadian person, yet I can buy a foreign, if I can't own my own self, but I can own a former other, then it strikes me that there's some issues that we need to work out in our globalized world. That somehow either we need to be operating within a similar cultural filter, a similar cultural optic, but currently we're not on that same page. So now I have a set of bones in my installation upstairs, and I give them to you to contend with the questions, some of the questions that I have contended with. 6 months after I opened, 6 months after I received my package from Canada, I traveled to India to see if I could discover what that material meant within its domestic culture. I discovered that I operate through a cultural filter that is not common, it's not worldwide, it's not universal. The personal turns out not to be universal. The personal turns out to be culturally specific. I did my due diligence. I did as much research about the bone industry as I could as a layperson and as an artist and not a researcher of the history of medicine. I came back from India with the permission to use those bones as material. The bones upstairs are not an individual. It's a set of osteological specimens derived from a number of different bodies, industrially processed with efficiencies in established economies of body material in a foreign context. I have used these remains as artistic materials. I'm using those remains as artistic materials, full knowing that they are acceptable in some communities of our culture here in Ottawa, in Canada, in the West, and unacceptable in other communities of our culture. I feel that as an artist, it's my job and my role to provoke questioning. I feel that it's my role and my job to disturb. By disturbing, I mean moving people from one assumption into another spot. So if I can open up questioning for people and help people to grow in some way, I feel that I've performed my task. After some lengthy thought, research, travel, interviewing, self-informing, I elected to use the specimen that I purchased to deploy a narrative about a global condition, about who has the right to be considered, what was the word used? What's the respect and dignity to the body?
Who has the right to decide? Who has the right to...
I'll back up a little bit. How is it that we in the world give no respect to some living and every respect to some dead? This is hypocrisy to me. This is a hypocrisy. I'm troubled by that hypocrisy. It disturbs me in my place in the world. Today, in Canada, the peacekeeping, peacemaking country that I grew up in, that formed and created my value system, is murdering people in Iraq and Syria. I don't feel comfortable having my tax dollars go to a murdering mission. I want that to stop. I'm trying to provoke a conversation that helps us take responsibility for our complicity in a world order that is undignified and disrespectful. I know that if my neighbors are arguing with their teenagers or their adolescents, it's not my job as a neighbor to bust down their door and break their stuff and kill their people. I think the same is true of... I don't think we have any business in other sides of the world murdering people with our tax dollars, selling desperate people weaponry to facilitate the murder of their kin. So the installation you see upstairs between here and there is a very difficult piece, the most difficult piece that I have taken on in my career. And I'm hoping it will provoke those questions and I ask the viewer of my artwork to ask yourself, what choices do we act to make the world commensurate with our value system? If we believe that human lives are entitled to dignity, we should help to dignify human life. Human life needs to be more respected than remains, because the remains don't feel and the remains don't pine for a better tomorrow. The remains don't pine for a 360 horizon with fat cattle in an affluent meadow. In part of myself, I believe, just as those 4 young men on the risk sign stand in embrace of the dead, I ask of my viewer to say, if we can't take care of our own, what are we doing out there taking care of others in are outside of our context, outside of our country, outside of our cultural framework, outside of our understanding. I don't believe we have. I don't believe we have a role there. It's not our business. Yes, I want the women in Afghanistan to be educated on their terms. It's not for us to bomb them into education. It's not for us to bomb the Syrian people into democracy. It's not for us to bomb Iraq into a Western cultural value framework. It needs to stop. And we need to use our democratic structures, our vote, our one vote to make it stop. It hurts. Please make it stop. So I thank those individuals who, quote, donated, unquote, were homeless, were impoverished, were unclaimed, and went into the medical specimen economy to help facilitate my narrative. I honor those lives, I honor those deaths, and I thank them for helping me make this plea. So thank you for being here. Thank you for your perspectives and helping me make this point. And thank you for your attention.
Hey, I'm not often speechless, but I'm pretty speechless at this point. But I think that is a sign of respect for everything that was said. And as you can see, some of I thought what was so amazing about the presentations and the kind of affinities, although it may not seem like directly there are affinities, there were many layers of affinities, and there were also things that were kind of through lines. And I think one of course, the most important thing is this question around that I heard was between this question of the flesh or the bodies that are alive, the bodies that can do things, the bodies that have choice, the bodies that don't have any choice, the bodies that are incarcerated, the bodies that don't have the economic means to live in the kind of privileged place that we live in, and to be able to have actually the privilege to be here and to think about these levels of issues. And so those are one of the things I just thought, like, what was very interesting for me is that, and what I thought was very, very important about being gathered here and sharing these stories is that we thought a lot more about bodies than we did about bones. Like bodies, like as you said, it's the flesh. It's here, us in the flesh, in our bodies. And I just think that that in a way, I think is something that the exhibition itself really speaks to. So to think about the bones without thinking about the bodies, I think is actually what the point of this panel was in some way, right? Is that they don't actually exist one without the other. So I can ask a question of the panelists, and I'm certainly would certainly very happy to do so. But it's a large audience out there. We have all, as bodies, spoken. I'm sure we could say more, but I would like to see. I know it's a bit dark. I don't know if we could. I guess turn on more lights or something. It's very hard for the audience to see. Yeah, like we're like, whoa. It's kind of like, bring it up and bring maybe the audience lights up as much as possible, so that So firsthand, thank you. Just I think if people stand up, it would really help because there's a lot of people here, and do we have a floating mic?
I can yell it out.
Okay, go for it.
So, Nicola, I was fascinated by you saying you went to India to do due diligence. Could you explain a little more about your trip to India, and was it was it before you opened the box of bones, or you mentioned 6 months, and I was just trying to keep track of when the 6-month period is that you went to India.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So a little bit of backstory. I paid for the bones over 3 years on a layaway plan, which is strangely product-defying of the body. But the body, like, let's be honest and practical, is a product. There are huge industries and massive wealth created off of bodily remains. So let's just put that aside. And really, you can shop for everything and anything on the internet. So I received my last installment on my payment plan from my husband for my birthday, and I promptly received the bone box in the mail. It arrived in my studio, and I had an idea that if anybody remembers that scene from Pulp Fiction, and they're sitting in the cafe and the whatever precious cargo that they're carrying in the briefcase, he opens up the briefcase and there's like this of light, and he quickly closes it back as if it's a Pandora's box. So I had a kind of Pandora's box narrative running, and all kinds of, it's amazing how much one can grow with the creation of a project. But I had myself attached to all kinds of kind of crazy and cliched, now seeming cliched narratives associated with those bones. And so I got the bones in late July of last year. And I wanted to make sure I had done all the kind of intellectual story gathering before I opened the box, because I expected this to be a very precious and rare moment where maybe there would be some spirit, soul, aura released from the Scotch tape. And so I was very fortunate to have been awarded funding from 3 levels of government to do my research and in search of the piece. I called it In Search of the Piece because I didn't have an idea of how I was going to use these bones. It's not like that installation upstairs was conceived and I went about looking for bones to complete the installation. And in fact, the installation was grown out of the bones. And so I went to... The reason I found the bones is because I read an article, which I found one night when I was researching my past piece. I read an article on Wired magazine website by an American journalist who was living in India at the time named Scott Carney. And he wrote an essay about the bone trade, and which focused extensively on the Indian bone trade, but a little bit of information about China, Taiwan, and Africa. And so ultimately this article was redrafted and lengthened and published as a book called Red Market, which talks about the market in human materials in general. So I did this kind of performative thing where I took Scott Carney's article and I followed it, because it was Scott Carney who led me to the company Osta International in White Rock, BC, to buy the bones. And so I followed that gesture and I went and met all the individuals cited in the essay. And I went to all those locations in India that he describes. And in so doing, I spent a little over a week in Varanasi, literally breathing the particulate remains of the cremated dead at the edge of the Ganges, living in a small hostel right on the edge of the fire pits. And then I went to Calcutta, now called Kolkata, but nobody in Kolkata calls it Kolkata. They all still call it Calcutta because they recognize that they are and will always be a colonial town. That's what I'm told. And I phoned up a man who is the CEO of a company called Young Brothers, and Young Brothers is said to be the largest business in medical specimens and educational materials in India. And I called him up and I said, "Hello, my name is Nicola. I think we have a conversation to have. Can I come over and visit?" And he said, "Yes, come tomorrow afternoon." And so I did, and I proceeded to hang out with Mr. Aaron for the next week. And over that period of time, I built up trust. And every day, my daughter, who accompanied me on the trip, and I went over to have lunch with him and spend the afternoon with him. He disclosed a little more and a little more and a little more and a little more. And on our next to last day, he took out a number of skeletal specimens so that I could handle them and I could know them. I showed him photographs of what I understood to be in the box that was still unopened, that photographs that were basically sales devices that came to me from the vendor. And we had discussions a little bit about where they might come from, the nature of the export business in India, why it became illegal in 1985 to export bones, what that did to his business, what it did to the communities, the economies of the communities who for hundreds of years, basically since colonialism and the medical, and the history of anatomy, what happened to those local economies as a result of the ban on the export. And it's widely held among that group of people who were managing the export that somebody famous was grave robbed in this particular town, very small town north of Kolkata called Purvastali. And when it was discovered that this famous person was grave robbed, the whole sort of business blew up. Now, in this particular village, it's a little bit north and around the bend and on the Ganges. And so when bodies are cremated or partially cremated, or not cremated but thrown into the Ganges in their funerary rituals, certain things happen to the body, and they ultimately come up from the ground, the depths of the river, and they float and they go upriver, and they get caught up on the bushes or the grasses, and the Dom community who live on the riverside and who are the untouchables, or the Dalit in India, who handle everything to do with death. They collect the remnants of the dead from the river bed and the river edges, and they process those remains and they sell them into both religious ritual supply routes and medical research and education supply routes. So when the export was closed down, those communities lost their livelihood, and these are livelihoods that have been well developed over hundreds of years, basically. So in this little community of Purvastali where I went with a young artist who's a graffiti artist and also very interested in issues around the body and colonialism and post-colonial sort of perspectives onto the bodies of others, and in particular brown people. We went on a little excursion to Purvastali and we met lots of people, and we hung out in Purvastali for a day. And so I was able to get a little bit of a sense of who that community is, where that was principally a body processing community. And it was a very intense journey, and I was very grateful to have been traveling with my daughter, because her existence and her presence with me kept sort of helped me keep a ground in sort of my place. So Mr. Aaron really wanted to facilitate my project in a big way. He believed in my narrative, and he thought that the political story I was bringing to my narrative, the political story that I was bringing to my work with bones was very fresh and different. He'd never heard of anything like that, because he only ever worked with the medical trade. And so we lamented about how it would be a bad thing for me to take bones out of India, and that I should come back. And when I came back, he would introduce me to his, quote, collection, unquote. So we left as friends, his daughter calling me auntie, and him referring to him referring to himself as uncle to my daughter. He was not the kind of nefarious, like, dude making his wealth off the backs of unethical practices, as Scott Carney had described him. He was a single dad struggling with business in a way that he had, and his father, that he had always done business. I came back to home, to my studio. I traveled over Christmas. I was there, in fact, for Christmas. And I got back to my studio, and I spent, a few days, 3, 4, 5 days, just in contemplation and meditation over the still sealed box. And then I opened it. There was no, like, coming out of my box like in Pulp Fiction. And there was no aura, and there was no soul being released from the cardboard. It was, in fact, there was a skull that was all marked up like a Victorian medical or anatomy class with all the quadrants, or like a kind of what is it called, or the eugenic kind of descriptions of the quadrants, like you might find in an acupuncture shop or something like that. And it was very dark brown and like an antique skull of a very old person. And then there was a huge negotiation with the supplier, and it really kind of descended to, but I ordered blue jeans and you sold me brown jeans. I really want the brown jeans. How come you, like, what is my recourse as a consumer? And I realized I had just fallen out of my imagination and into the reality of the bones. And the bones were a product and the bones were a specimen. And then I realized I went to India to find permission to use the bones as artistic material. And
What does that mean? To use the bones as, like, I don't know what you mean by that.
Some people use paint, some people use photography, some people use beads, or...
The permission, I think.
Oh, the permission was that my acculturation led me to believe in certain stories about the bones that weren't necessarily relevant, except for to my acculturation, but they weren't universal, and they most certainly didn't hold in Calcutta.
So by virtue of that, you got permission. That's what you mean by the...
I let myself off the hook, pretty much. The bones became osteological materials. They became the prop that I would use to propel a viewer of my work into my story, which is a geopolitical story about who has right in life and who does not. Pretty much.
It's a very utilitarian view you take.
Yes, it is. Yeah. But life and death is black and white.
I meant it more in the way of the fact that your position is that, or I don't mean to speak for you, but the idea that of the human body as raw materials.
We're out there making a lot of bodies, and some people are licensed to exploit flesh and bone and hair and fingernails for profit, and some people aren't. And
But the question is do you believe that the human body is a source of raw material?
well, I've been harvesting my hair for 20 years. I made a sculpture from my placenta. So, by action, I would have to say yes.
I think you've got it as that's not all that she thinks it is. But the human body is all of those things. The thing for me is to fetishize it when it's dead in a set of bones, as if that is so extraordinarily more transgressive a treatment than the fact that we have young children who are completely, literally enslaved and engaged in sex work in some place. We can take Senegal, we can take a number of places, and we don't see those children. And they're living, breathing children whose quality of life is extremely, extremely marginal. So it's not about excusing one or the other, but there is something disturbing to me about having the primary preoccupation be with the remains. Sarjeet Bartman is like that for me. Sarjeet Bartman is not about remains. Sarjeet Bartman is about a profound racism about black female bodies and black female sexuality. That's the starting point of her narrative. What happens to her at the end with the plastic cast is not, in fact, the most important part of the story. What is important is a white male notion of black female bodies in and of themselves. And there's some interesting things because there's a similar kind of thing about white women who were in the sex trade as well. This idea, because she had a very pronounced buttocks and certain parts of her anatomy were very pronounced, that this revealed something inherent about us as black women and about our sexuality. They take this woman from that life out of context. They purport to be doing science, but they're not. But very much like the Medicis and their wonderful anatomy parties, that is the least of my problem when they take a living human being and people are dressed up for the evening and they strip this black body naked. They end up abandoning that black body and she ends up being exhibited in freak shows, right? Then she gets extremely ill and she cannot be cured. The woman is dying and they're bargaining over her body. So, yes, because the whole point of it was to preserve her as a specimen. She's alive. They preserve her as a specimen. But I'm saying, but when they excise those parts, they're not excising them for science. They're excising the parts of the black female transgressive body that is so unlike the feminine white female body that is not so transgressive. So to me, to get it all the way to the end and say, well, what? And I agree with you about all of those pieces. Mandela came in, and I was shocked that it was not enough for Nelson Mandela to ask for the repatriation of, she's Khoi, like they say the Hottentot Venus, but she's Khoi, right? Khoi or Khoisan, right? So I'm saying, but she became known as the Hottentot Venus, taking that image out of white artist and attached to her. So I think my struggle is to be so preoccupied that we can't have the conversation and we can't create the discomfort because that piece is somehow eclipsing the actual volume, which is huge volume of bodies that are victims of war, victims of our geopolitics and all those pieces. So I think that's more where I'm coming from on that. Not that I don't agree, I just simply can't rank it higher. I rank it as important, but I don't rank it higher than the living bodies.
You don't rank what higher?
I'm saying simply the fact of Nicola having at the end of the day said, to satisfy myself that I don't have a political prisoner who's actually been abused, or that I can understand. I get that because that's part of what's happening with the Chinese bodies. We know that the politics there means that we could be talking about someone who, by any stretch of our imagination, we don't believe they should be in prison at all. So part of the conversation we're having is one of a judgment about Chinese politics. We're having a judgment about the notions of innocence. But I don't think it's just about plastination and bodies. In fact, they're selling, the biggest story I remember earlier than this was the selling of their organs, that these people were in that situation of because we have a body market for that as well. So the problem is us. We are consuming various aspects of other people's bodies, and Nicola's use is the least in that broad continuum. Some people's bodies get commodified immediately for us. We can see sex trade, we can see labor exploitation, etc. But the actual consumer product of those bodies, we have the ability to buy. They never are buying their own bodies. We are the consumer. So it is about us, and I think that's what your piece is about very much, is talking about, in a different way from her, that accountability. So I'm actually hearing that loud and clear, that you're talking about that accountability too. But when it comes to art, I have a little bit of a different space where I'm looking at art, purpose, message, conversation, and that's shifting a little bit my assessment.
I think there's like a certainly quite indisputable what Nicola was saying about the hierarchy of, obviously we have to prioritize living people over dead bodies. I mean, I don't think that anybody would possibly contest that statement. I mean, it is self-evident, if anything. But I think what's interesting is the linkage between the organ trade, for example, and the cadaver trade, because both of them are quite prolific, and there's a lot of money being made across both spheres. So there is a linkage, and there's also something like what's going to happen in 20 years. Right now, Body Worlds has 13,000 willed donors. They've had to shut down their donors. They have too many now. So how can we envision a world when we, like, or what does that world look like with, 13,000 dead bodies, playing archery for 4,000 years? I think it raises very fundamental moral questions about society. And it's certainly not to dismiss some of the poignant issues that Nicola is raising. But I think we can't discount that those are also quite fundamental questions, because they model the kind of society that we want to live in.
I'd like to actually just maybe turn it back to the audience, and just as a general response to say that actually I think what we're here tonight is to think about how art and an art exhibition can raise, I think, a very complex and intimate in some ways. There's an intimacy to being in a gallery and to reflecting on the work and to asking yourself questions that I think is actually not kind of immediately equatable, or I think there are two conversations to have. The whole Body Worlds thing is about the spectacularity of the body, and I believe this exhibition, from my perspective anyway, is about the intimacy and about precisely asking where those two things uncomfortably rub up, that they ask you precisely what Joanne is asking. But I'd really like to turn it back to the audience. If people, I know it's been a long and intense evening. It's like, oh, my brain hurts. Right? Maybe my body too. There's been a lot to think about. It is. It's like, I think it's like really kind of unnerving to think about body sex trades when bodies are alive, and bone trades when there's bones, and they all seem to have a hugely geopolitical thing in common. Well, they're not particularly from Ottawa, Ontario. So I think to bring those kinds of issues to Ottawa, into the Ottawa Art Gallery, make us try to maybe think a little bit about this. It's been really, really important. But I really, would love if there were other people, if you had just questions or comments, or you'd like to share a story about bones, your bodies. He's very quiet. Yes.
I have a story about bones.
Thank you.
But I also have questions. I worked at what is called the Benjamin Franklin House in London, England, which is a historical museum where Benjamin Franklin lived for 16 years in London. And part of the tour that takes place starts in the basement. And the first thing that they show is a glass floor, and underneath are semi-uncovered bones in the ground. And that was because at the time that Benjamin Franklin lived there, he essentially housed a medical facility in the basement where a doctor who was married to the landlady's daughter lived. And they would receive bodies, which we've uncovered not through donated bodies, but through essentially grave robbers, who would go and sell them bodies for anatomical classes and lessons and learnings, and then they would go out and just bury them in the garden in the back. And then we had later then put an addition very later, and then when we were doing restoration, we found bones and there had to be a murder inquiry, and because the bones were over 125 years, I believe, they didn't do it. They apparently at that point it doesn't matter. So that was kind of interesting. So now it's part of the show. When you go and see the life of Benjamin Franklin in this house, you get to learn about these bones that are somewhat uncovered through this glass floor, and it's very, very weird. My question is to Nicola. We talked a lot about the geopolitical context in this. Excuse my ignorance, but has this show been, I know it's quite new, has it been exhibited anywhere else, and what are your plans for it? Because I feel like if you exhibit it in another continent, in a different country, in a different culture, it's going to have different contexts, different narrative, different questions perhaps. We're seeing them obviously through the lens that we're in because that's where we are. So I just wanted to sort of know your plans and sort of your ideas and what you would sort of anticipate in the future with this particular exhibit.
It's brand new. Like literally, I've seen it for the first time, the same time everybody else did at the opening. And there is a plan with the Ottawa Art Gallery to tour it, although we don't have as yet confirmed other venues. And it is true that no matter where you put an artwork, it reads differently because language and ideas are culturally specific. So I can't venture to say how it might be received by people who think and are acculturated differently than I am. It's not for me. It's not for me to say that. But I do have to say that I'm really troubled by this idea of focus on bones and focus on what might have happened 120 years ago, whereas last year on my birthday, Israeli army started murdering Palestinians. And let's not talk about excavating a gravesite from a former anatomist of 120 years ago. Let's talk about removing rubble from children last year. Like, we can't imagine that. Like, Sudan fundamentally changed me. I could not have imagined Sudan before going there. I can tell you, without traveling to a war zone, it is absolutely unimaginable. And those people who are coming from over there to join the safety of our privilege, they've seen well beyond what you and I can imagine. And I think it's a disservice to our contemporary times to root this conversation in kind of old known stories of the ethics of how we in our cultural specificity relate to remains, because people relate to remains all over the world in very, very different ways. Like the Zoroastrians of the north of India and Tibet and in the north of Iraq, you know how they deal with the remains of their dead? They put them in a white tower, they hack them into little bits, and they let the vultures consume them so they can be returned to the ground. Now, are we to call that disrespectful? This is another cultural paradigm that we can't even begin to imagine, and certainly don't feel comfortable with because it's not our culture. But I do know that it hurts to excavate your child or your wife or your mother or your grandma. It hurts to lose your young men, the people who are supposed to be building society, struck down to warring culture. And this is flesh and these are bodies. We are actively producing on industrial scale, we are producing death and dead bodies. Let's ask ourselves, what are the ethics in that? Let's have that conversation. It's, you know, I'm tired of the political correctness. I'm tired. All it does is help us keep our head in the sand. Take our heads out of the damn sand and look at the world we're creating. I don't want more Palestinian children killed. 4,300 58 people killed over the month of July and August in 2014. And our Prime Minister is standing there saying, "We stand with you, Israel." I would like to stand with Israel, but I can't stand by that behavior. And I love your story about the Ben Franklin gravesite, and they're excavating mass grave burial grounds all over England, and that's what happens in ancient societies. Each one of us on earth is going to produce a set of bones, and we have to put those bones somewhere, and people are going to come in future generations and they're going to find those bones. And you know the hospital in Calcutta is full up with how many people? 13,000 people waiting to perform afterlife and body worlds. You think those homeless people who are living on the sidewalks of Calcutta have an option for a cremation? There's no money for a cremation. There's no education to know you can will your body into some fancy high-tech project for the West to consume. They don't have that privilege. We have the privilege to be sitting here having this conversation about the ethics of showing remains in an artistic context. This is privilege we have. Other people in the world don't have this privilege. I'm asking you, put ourselves in their shoes. You see the child across the street who's being beaten by the stepfather. Put ourselves in that child's shoes. Now, put ourselves in that child's shoes on the other side of the world and ask ourselves what we can do with the privilege to make it stop. I'm fascinated by 120-year-old bones, like with all respect to your
Nicola,
story.
if I could just interrupt, like, to be the devil's advocate, I'm certainly not undermining the kinds of concerns that you're raising here tonight, but we are also talking about your exhibition upstairs, and you are using human remains. And the context such as that is that you're recycling these human remains. And you have to address that other than saying, let's stop the killing in Palestine.
I worked on human remains at the Ottawa Art Institute. The Ottawa Art Institute is recycling human remains.
I'm not, the question is not about the fact that you're recycling human remains. The question is, why don't you address that fact?
I don't know how else to address it. I'm using human remains as material for educating myself, for aesthetic positioning, and for educating the public. In the medical school, we use human remains for educating ourselves, our researchers, our students.
But you're not a teacher, you're a contemporary artist. You're feeding it back into the economy. Are you saying that your exhibition is not for sale? Are you saying that you didn't raise money by doing this exhibition? There's a cycle that you're complicit in. So we can't just talk about Palestine. We have to talk about the cycle that you're actively participating in. And it's not a judgment to say that you're not allowed to participate in it, because I absolutely don't believe in censorship. But what I'm trying to get at is the nuance and how you're trying to make a statement about that in and of itself, because it's transparent to our gaze. It's a privileged space in art gallery. You're an artist. Are you selling your work or not? Is it for sale? Can someone buy that work upstairs?
I think she's answered it. I think you just don't like the answer she's given, because if you were sitting in her position, the bottom line, just let me finish.
I didn't ask you the question, I asked Nicola.
No, but
you're
you're debating with her, and we're here to talk about the art.
We talked about this being a place of shared stories, and so I would really like you to enable everyone to speak to this. It's not about asking just one person.
Why can't my answer get questioned? My question get answered. It was a simple question. Is Nicola's work upstairs for sale? Or is she making a statement that it is not for sale? It's a simple question. You don't have to answer it.
I don't have a commercial model for my artistic practice. I am not represented by a commercial gallery, and there are no price tags upstairs.
So if someone offered to buy it, would you sell it?
Okay, I think we're going to actually just roll this back a little bit. I mean, I think this is a conversation. It's actually a conversation that I think is a really important one. The questions are questions that are valid, but maybe this isn't just the right context or space to have that, and I think you and Nicola can continue that conversation. But I will say that these questions of asking, we're all, like, I mean, this is why I did actually take some time at the beginning, which would be uncharacteristic of what I would normally do as a moderator, to say, we are talking about complex issues. We're talking about ethics, and we're talking about history, and we're talking about different kinds of ways we see the world, and we're talking about neoliberalism and geopolitics. We're talking about, like, black bodies and Chinese bodies and white privilege and Western privilege and sex trades and prisoners. There's a lot that's in this room, and there's a lot of ghosts in this room right now. So I think that and those ghosts tell us that all of us are, like, to ask this question, are you complicit or not? I think perhaps we have to start the conversation by saying, we are always, avant la lettre, we are always in our flesh complicit with something. So if we just start from that place and then think about actually, let's think about bones, let's think about bodies, but let's think about ghosts too. Like, there's a lot, we're conjuring a lot of very hard things to think about here. And what's interesting is that Nicola says, when I opened the box of bones, there was no spirit. And that's because the bones are just bones till you tell them stories, until they mean something to you. And surely that's what these bones mean in this context. Yes?
I think it's a very good question, but it's not the key question. My question as an artist, I don't need this. I'm a visual artist, and a question to Nicola as an artist would be, have you considered making the bones? As you made the other objects with glass or the butterflies with paper? Could you convey the same message if you, instead of using real bones that belong to a human being, would make the bones with clay or plastic or whichever material you have available as a visual artist? Have you considered that?
Okay, this might come as a surprise to you, but I don't make things. I engage other people's phenomenal expertise to make things on behalf of my vision.
Could somebody else make the bones for you, for your show? Would you consider that?
I didn't go into this installation needing bones. I made a performative gesture of diving into my uncomfortable spot and made a down payment on a set of osteological specimens at an internet supplier. Sorry I'm doing this, I just can't see you. And it was the existence of the bones that brought the installation into being. So for me to have made bones would be to actually invert the project. So no, I don't work with clay. There's an artist that Cindy Stelmakvich curated in a wonderful exhibition. Where was that? In Halifax, with an artist who made clay femurs, a big, beautiful artwork of a pile of clay femurs. But that's her work. That's not what I do. And there's a certain Deschampian sort of thing in my work, which I'm bringing narratives together through objects. There are, when I did Mean Body, I made my body through training to get scanned. When I did the Reliquarium, I made my intensity through sleep deprivation and sort of a disciplined conceptual process. And but my craft is storytelling, and my craft is bringing meaning together, and my craft is selecting objects from which viewers can then go and interpret into a narrative form. So it's a very interesting question, but it pertains to another kind of artistic process that I don't have. So those butterfly wings, I designed those wings, but somebody else made those wings. Those butterfly bodies come out of some other person's labor endeavor. I hired somebody to make the risk sign. I engaged young men to lend their bodies to display the bones. So, so that's my process. I made a news feed, but what I've done is edited a selection of headline generators and worked with another collaborator to generate a code for me to, in service of the vision. So if I had a different kind of like a more wet process, then yes, for sure, that might have come to me to make a body, but I am making in another kind of way.
Thank you.
Is there another, someone have I realized the last story of bones really took us into some amazing, actually, dialogue and conversation, which I really hope will continue after the panel ends, because it's an unfinished dialogue. It's just that I wanted to make sure that the audience was also part of this. Is there anyone else who'd like to, yes?
I have a little remark. I like the passion behind everybody's comments today. I said I like this doesn't turn on. It's true. I like the passion. You can hear me, can't you? Yeah. I like the passion behind everybody's comments, but I was struck by the fact that Nicola recycled parts of her body. And years ago, like 20 years ago, I was in Australia. And I was drawing in the Institute of Anatomy, and what struck me the most was that the Aboriginal make use of every part of their body. They use the blood to sting their feathers on themselves. They use the hair to make little bags to carry their food and things. And I just thought it was really interesting when you said you use parts of your, you looked at your body. They looked at their body as a way of reusing what they have. So I thought you'd just find that interesting. That's a comment, and thanks for the great discussion.
Thank you, Jerry.
Is there anyone else who would like to share a story of bodies, bones, ghosts? I'm a big fan of ghosts. That's just me. Yeah.
Well, at the risk of also lightening the mood a little bit, we were talking a little bit about perspectives and that different cultures have different perspectives. The Thracians used to mourn when a child was born, and they would rejoice when someone died.
Who
The Thracians, the ancient Thracians. So the culture didn't live for that long. But it's not necessary to mourn when someone dies. It's not necessary to rejoice when someone is born either. Actual, therefore possible. That did happen. So, there are different perspectives, and it's very nice to be introduced to different ones.
So I actually just want to share one to lighten the mood, sort of. So I work a lot with bones, or I'm around bones a lot because I work a lot with questions of the disappeared and DNA testing and forensic science. And I'm not a forensic scientist, but I write that, and I've been in a lot of the labs. And I was in Guatemala a few months ago, and we did for a conference that was speaking about various issues. We did a tour of the forensic, the archives, and then the place where they gather the bones from the various grave sites, and then forensic anthropologists painstakingly put the bones together. And so there's all these bones laid out in various tables, and it's about whether you can actually put enough bones together to construct a body. And then once they think they have one, and they do DNA testing, and then there's families that will claim the body. They put it in a box, put a number on it, and they're all piled up at the entrance, right? And so most of the people who are in my group were from Canada, and some from the US, but they had never, this was not their field, and they were like very shocked and, you know, breathless, and felt that, you know, you couldn't really make a joke. And, you know, I was sort of chatting with everyone, and I said to the forensic anthropologist, like, she's an archaeologist, I said, well, you know, what's it like working with these bones all the time, right? Like, is it like a little traumatic or something? And she goes, oh, God, no. She says, this is so much more interesting than working on pottery charts for the 45 years. This is way more meaningful, and it's just more interesting. So, I mean, you know, bones and what we do with them is about the stories attached to them, really. And I think that's why when, you know, just to go back, I think that when you ask a question about remains, maybe you're going to get a story back, is what happens. And maybe you don't like the story, or maybe the story will be about, like, Israeli and Palestinians, but surely that's one of the kinds of functions both of art, of this exhibition, and then of why one would actually put bones in a gallery, which I, as you could imagine, don't really, I'm lit on, like, I don't really have a lot of problems with the bones in the body. In fact, I said to Nicola when I first came to her studio, I told her, actually, I also work a lot in, it's another story, but just to say that bones are a part of my kind of worldview. The way people use bones, the way bones speak, the way you bury bones, then you actually unbury them. This is the Guarani in northern Argentina. And, you know, we had a long conversation about the bones on many levels, because I didn't expect to find bones in someone's studio, just sort of like all piled there. But like when I came back to visit Nicola, like about a couple months later, like I was really happy to see the bones. It was like an old friend. I thought, oh, there they are, right? So I mean, it is, you know, I think we have to kind of think that there are many layers to how we can think about this, and many different cultural kinds of ways in. And I hope lots of stories, way more than we could tell here. And, you know, I'm kind of more a fan of telling stories when, like, we're in a circle and there's a kind of sunlight streaming in. This is not perhaps the most ideal place, but nevertheless, you've been a fantastic audience. You sat there.
I just wanted to make a quick statement, if you wouldn't mind. So I don't disagree with the fact that we can be happy about talking about bones, but we haven't yet had the opportunity to talk about the fact that there's a legacy within the art exhibit and the museum context that Indigenous communities have not been able to participate in the display of their own remains.
I'm actually going to take my
so I just like
privilege
to make that point.
Yes,
that's all.
I'm just going to take my privilege as a moderator and say that is a really an interesting point, but unfortunately it came at 2 hours into the panel, and I noticed someone had
part of my presentation.
Okay. I can see that, like, these are contentious issues, and people, and certainly I would not want to think as a panelist that we don't want to silence anyone, but the problem is that I think this is a conversation that perhaps what we need to do is have a panel precisely about those kinds of issues. We are not actually, and I made that very clear in my introductory remarks, that we understand the question of Indigenous bones in the museum and repatriation. I don't think there's anyone in this room who does not actually have some understanding of those kinds of issues. That is not actually the core kind of the way that the conversation went. So, but I think it's a really, really important issue and deserves a panel of its own, actually. And I appreciate your comment, but it deserves a panel, actually.
It doesn't need to be segregated. It can be incorporated into a diverse conversation.
Yes, but we're actually, unfortunately, really out of time.
Can I just say one thing, Dot, which is that throughout the creation of this project, which has been a long time now, it's been 4 years that I've been working towards this project, I'm very aware that every culture has its position on this very contentious bit of material that I'm using. And there is a position that I am reifying a very major component of the critique that I am attempting to make, and the lines that I'm trying to draw together. But that is a risk.
Mm-hmm.
It's a risk that I'm taking because I believe in the higher narrative, and I understand that there are implications to the history of colonialism in the exploitation of the remains of the others. And Mara, I really appreciate you bringing that back to the fore. But it is very difficult to speak in a society as diverse as ours and to not offend somebody. And at some point, we have to risk the offense to be in our integrity and to make the higher statement and to provoke the kind of self-reflection that I'm trying to provoke.
Absolutely, and what comes next is criticism, and in the art world, the criticism is, well, is the work good or not?
I'm going to give the floor back to Dot to wrap up. I just wanted to say I honor the cultural specificity of the many cultures with whom we live. I'm operating for my culture, which is many cultures. And it's very difficult in a society that is so desperately wanting to put everybody in its own category. I don't belong to a category. If I were to put myself in a category, I would go insane because there is no category. I cannot default to sectarianism. There is no defaulting for tribe for a person like me. So I can respect and appreciate the many cultures and the many traditions, but at the end of the day, I have to stand on my ground. And so in this place, I've elected to, in my integrity, use the bones that pre-existed me, destined to a medical anatomical education classroom, and say, this time, the art gallery is the classroom.
Did you have something you would like to say?
I'm going to make a personal statement. I'm speaking as a Jamaican woman. I'm speaking as a Jamaican woman who was early brought in my culture to stand by the motto of Jamaica, which is out of many one. And I was taught early in my culture that I can refer to myself as a victorious woman, victorious child of the Middle Passage. I come from a culture in which the First Nations, indigenous people of Jamaica, the Taino, were annihilated in 3 generations after Christopher Columbus landed on the island. Out of many one means that everyone who stepped foot on the island of Jamaica are part of my culture, part of my ancestry. The enslavers, the brutalizers, the oppressed, the oppressors. When we became independent, we adopted the motto, we are all one people, we're Jamaicans. Our coat of arms is 2 Taino people, the indigenous people of Jamaica, standing side by side. This is who we are. I came to Canada married to a man whose family had also been traumatized through the Hitler regime. And together we had a child. And if I were creating the mission statement as a young mother for the daughter I would like to raise, the questions I would like her to pose, the conversations I would like her to stimulate, the confidence that she would have to take risks, to stimulate these conversations, to make a difference to Canada, to the nation of Canada that became her home because of a choice I made.
and to use the capacities that she had to contribute to building this nation and to raising the conversations of the self-reflection about oppression, about colonization, about cultural thoughts. I could do no better in that mission statement than to say, I wish that I would have a daughter like Nicola. So I, as a mother, but as an art historian myself, as a Canadian citizen, I give her such credit. And in this work, one of the things that I really wanted to see that she did, I know she would do it, but I wanted to see for myself. How did she treat those bones? What respect did she give to those bones? And I watched her build that case, and I watched her create the atmosphere with the butterflies. And I watched that figure of the young man cradling the bones, and I thought, you could call this pietà, because there's that warm and careful cradling of the bones. And so, yes, I hope that it will cause a lot of conversations. And I hope that the conversations that it will raise will not be a critique about how she used it, but a critique about how we use one another. We go on about, I will die and my bones will be left, and I won't really care how anyone treats the bones. I do care how they treat me right now. And so I think this is one of the messages that I hope that the conversations will raise, that we will talk about the things that Nicola brought up, about the children who are dying, but we don't care about them. But if we saw the bones of one of them, we would be very careful about taking care of it. It's not about the bones. Thank you.